Get out here, now. Those words cracked through the quiet suburban night like a thunderclap, shattering the peace of the cul-de-sac where families usually ended their evenings with laughter, TV, or bedtime stories for their children. For Linda Carter, a middle school teacher known for her calm nature and soft voice, those words weren't just noise, they were the start of something she couldn't yet comprehend. She stood at the threshold of her own front door, trembling, as three men in uniforms that looked almost like police gear stared her down with cold, arrogant eyes. Their shiny badges caught the glow of the porch light, but something about them felt off: cheap metal, wrong placement, the kind of thing you might see in a Halloween store. Linda had taught enough kids to know when something was fake, and right now her instincts screamed that these men were imposters. The tallest of the three stepped forward, his heavy boots echoing on the wooden porch, and jabbed a finger toward her yard. This property violates HOA rules. You're under arrest until we sort this out. The words hit Linda like ice water. Arrest? For what? She wasn't even part of the HOA, never had been. Their home stood just outside the boundaries of the association, yet these men carried themselves as if they ruled the entire block. Her heart thumped wildly in her chest as she tried to process what was happening. She had spent the entire week grading papers, preparing lesson plans, and teaching her students how to divide fractions. Never in her wildest dreams did she imagine she'd be standing on her porch facing three self-proclaimed enforcers pretending to be the law. Trying to regain her composure, she attempted to close the door, her voice shaking but steady enough to say, "You can't do this. Where's your warrant? Where's your identification? Where are the real police?" But the man shoved his boot against the door, forcing it back open. The wooden frame groaned under the pressure as the other two crowded onto the porch, their presence suffocating. One of them smirked, leaning close enough that Linda could smell the stale stench of cigarettes clinging to his fake uniform. "Lady, we are the police." The mocking tone twisted in her stomach. Deep down she knew she should scream, call someone, run, anything, but fear had a grip on her, rooting her feet to the ground. The porch light flickered above her, and the night suddenly felt darker, heavier, as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. From behind drawn curtains, neighbors peeked out, their shadows flickering against the glow of television screens. Everyone knew about the so-called HOA security team. They were a nuisance, always patrolling like wannabe cops, threatening residents with fines, barking about rules that didn't even make sense. But tonight was different. Tonight they weren't just yelling about a mailbox being too tall or a lawn not trimmed. Tonight they were on Linda's porch, threatening her, invading her home, pretending they had the authority to take her away. And none of the neighbors stepped forward to help. Fear had silenced them, too. Linda swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand tall even though her knees felt weak. "You can't arrest me. I haven't done anything wrong." Her voice cracked at the end, betraying the storm of panic swirling inside her. The leader grinned, revealing crooked teeth. "Wrong answer." He took another step closer, the shadow of his frame casting over hers. He was too close now, his hand resting dangerously near the handle of a baton strapped to his belt. She took an instinctive step back, her mind racing. She thought of her students, the faces of children who relied on her every day. She thought of her home, her safe haven, now invaded by strangers who wanted to break her spirit. But most of all, she thought of her husband, Jack. Where was he? Did he hear this? The men had no idea whose house they had chosen tonight. Because Jack Carter wasn't just another suburban husband. He was a man forged in discipline, experience, and war. An ex-military veteran who had seen battlefields these imposters couldn't even imagine. He was a man who didn't need a badge to command authority. He was her protector, her shield, and though he preferred peace after years of service, the soldier inside him never truly left. From the back of the house, Jack was already on the move. At first, the raised voices made him think it was the usual HOA nonsense, someone complaining about trash bins or cars parked on the curb. But then he heard Linda's voice, high and panicked, words breaking with fear. That sound cut through him like a blade. The air inside him shifted, years of training sliding back into place. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He moved with precision, each step deliberate, silent, like he had done 1,000 times in the field. The commotion outside grew louder, the men laughing, mocking, their boots heavy on the porch boards. They thought they were in control. They thought Linda was alone. They were wrong. Jack approached the door, his pulse steady despite the storm he was about to unleash. He wasn't dressed for battle, just jeans and a plain t-shirt, but his presence carried a weight no uniform could match. He placed a hand on the doorknob, listening carefully for the right moment. He could hear one of the men say, "If you don't come quietly, we'll drag you out." HOA law, lady. Learn it. HOA law. The absurdity would have been laughable if it weren't so terrifying. Jack's jaw tightened. He turned the knob slowly, pushing the door open wider. The porch light cast his shadow across the wooden boards, and the laughter of the three men died instantly. Jack Carter stepped forward, his tall, broad frame filling the doorway. His eyes scanned them with the cold calculation of someone who had faced real threats, real battles. He said nothing at first, letting his presence alone speak louder than words. The imposters blinked, their smirks faltering as if they suddenly realized this wasn't the easy job they thought it would be. Linda felt her knees nearly give out, relief flooding through her at the sight of her husband. She knew him. She knew that calm expression, that quiet authority in his stance. It was the same look he carried when he talked about his years of service. A man who had been through fire and walked out the other side stronger. A man who would never let anyone harm her. For the first time that night, hope replaced her fear. The men didn't know it yet, but the moment Jack stepped onto that porch, the game had changed. This wasn't going to be an easy intimidation tactic. This wasn't going to be another night of bullying the neighborhood. They had stepped into the wrong house, picked the wrong family, and underestimated the wrong man. The suburban drama they thought they controlled was about to turn into a battlefield. And Jack Carter was ready to fight it on his terms. Jack Carter stood squarely in the doorway, his body a wall of calm strength that seemed to stop the air itself from moving. His presence was enough to make the three imposters falter, even if just for a heartbeat. He didn't raise his voice, didn't puff up his chest like they did. Instead, he spoke in a tone so steady, so low, that it cut sharper than any shout. "Step back. Now." The leader, a stocky man with mirrored sunglasses absurdly perched on his nose despite the late hour, gave a cocky grin as if to cover the fear that had just sparked in his eyes. "Who do you think you are? This is HOA business. Stay out of it." Jack's gaze hardened, narrowing to slits. "First," he said, counting off with his hand in a soldier's precision, "you're trespassing on private property. Second, you're impersonating police officers, which is a felony. Third, you just threatened my wife. You've got 30 seconds to walk off this porch before I decide you need a lesson you won't forget." His words weren't a threat, they were a fact delivered with the weight of someone who had spent years enforcing order on far more dangerous grounds. But arrogance is a stubborn disease. The man in the sunglasses laughed, trying to regain his swagger. "Big talk for a guy in a t-shirt. You don't scare us. We're the law here." One of the others, a lanky man with a patchy beard, sneered and stepped closer, jabbing a finger at Jack's chest. "Yeah, old man, why don't you go back inside before you get hurt?" That was the moment Jack moved. It wasn't wild, it wasn't reckless, it was precise, like the snap of a trap. His hand shot out, faster than the bearded man could react, seizing his wrist and twisting it backward with a controlled force that sent the man yelping in pain. Before the other two even registered what was happening, Jack shoved him against the porch railing, pinning him there with one arm while keeping his other hand free. The sound of wood creaking under the man's weight echoed into the night, and the neighbors watching from their windows gasped. "That's assault," the leader barked, stepping forward, his voice no longer confident but desperate. Jack didn't even look at him. "That's self-defense. And you're lucky that's all it is." He gave the pinned man a final push, releasing him. The man stumbled back, clutching his wrist, eyes wide with the sudden realization that this wasn't some pushover homeowner. This was someone trained, someone dangerous. The leader's face hardened, but his eyes betrayed the doubt creeping in. Still, he couldn't back down now, not with neighbors watching and his authority hanging by a thread. Pride pushed him forward where sense should have pulled him back. "You just made a big mistake," he growled, lunging at Jack with a clumsy punch. But Jack was already moving, his body shifting to the side in a smooth motion, letting the fist cut through empty air. In the same breath, Jack delivered a strike to the man's midsection, controlled, not enough to cause permanent damage, but enough to knock the wind out of him and drop him to one knee on the porch. The third man, jittery and twitchy, scrambled for something on his belt. A taser. His hands shook as he fumbled with it, raising it toward Jack. Linda's heart stopped. She wanted to scream, to run, but her voice was locked in her throat. Jack saw the movement out of the corner of his eye and reacted instantly. A swift kick, sharp and deliberate, sent the taser flying out of the man's hand. It clattered against the wooden boards before sliding into the bushes. "You done?" Jack asked, his voice calm, almost conversational, as if he hadn't just dismantled 3 attackers in less than 30 seconds. The porch was silent except for the ragged breathing of the so-called HOA cops, their bravado shattered, their bodies bruised, their confidence leaking away like air from a punctured tire. From the surrounding houses, curtains shifted, blinds tilted, and the glow of phones illuminated faces as neighbors recorded every second of the showdown. The men had come to humiliate and intimidate, but now they were the ones on display, their fake uniforms and false authority exposed under the porch light. Linda stood behind Jack, her trembling replaced by awe. She had always respected her husband's quiet strength, but seeing it in action, controlled, fearless, unstoppable, was something else entirely. He wasn't just her husband tonight. He was a shield between her and chaos, a soldier who had brought the discipline of the battlefield into their front yard. One of the impostors groaned, dragging himself to his feet, glaring at Jack with a mix of pain and fury. "You'll regret this," he spat, though his words wavered. "The HOA doesn't forget." Jack took a deliberate step forward, towering over him. "Neither do I. And you just wrote yourself into a chapter you won't like." The men backed away, stumbling down the porch steps, humiliated and shaken. They hadn't expected resistance, let alone someone who could dismantle them with such ease. Jack didn't chase them, didn't need to. His message was clear. His control was absolute. But this wasn't over. He knew it, and so did they. The leader clutched his side where Jack had struck him, his arrogance stripped away. He muttered something to the others, and together they staggered toward their car, trying to salvage what little dignity they had left. Jack didn't relax. He stood tall, watching them until they were off his property, his posture a silent warning, "Come back, and you'll regret it." The night air seemed to hum with the tension left behind. Neighbors whispered, their voices carrying through the quiet street. Some were scared, some were thrilled, but all of them knew one thing: something had shifted tonight. The bullies who had paraded around as fake enforcers had finally met their match. And his name was Jack Carter. Linda finally found her voice, stepping closer to her husband, her hand trembling as it reached for his arm. "Jack, what if they come back?" He turned his head slightly, meeting her eyes with a calm that steadied her heart. "Then I'll be here. And they'll know better than to try this again." His words weren't just for her. They were for everyone watching. For the neighbors peeking through curtains. For the imposters limping away. For the entire HOA that thought they could control the block with fear. Tonight, Jack Carter had sent a message, not with threats or bluster, but with action. The kind of message that couldn't be ignored. And though the imposters had fled into the shadows, Jack knew they weren't done. Men like that never walked away quietly. The fight had only begun. But unlike them, Jack didn't fear battles. He was trained for them. He lived through them. And if the HOA wanted to turn his quiet suburb into a battlefield, they had just met the one man who knew how to win wars. Jack didn't move from the porch even after the three imposters stumbled away into the darkness. He stood there like a statue carved out of stone, his arms crossed over his chest, his breathing steady, his eyes locked on the retreating figures until they disappeared beyond the glow of the street lamps. To the neighbors watching from behind curtains, it looked as if he had frozen the entire night in place, like nothing could continue until he gave permission. Linda exhaled slowly, the adrenaline still surging through her body, her hands trembling against the doorframe. She whispered, "Jack, they're gone. You can come inside." But Jack didn't budge. He knew men like them. He'd seen the same arrogance in war zones, in corrupt officers who thought power came from fear, in hired thugs who worked for someone else's dirty cause. These weren't just random troublemakers trying to flex their muscles. They were following orders, and if they were bold enough to impersonate law enforcement and storm his porch, it meant there was a bigger hand pulling their strings. The neighbors began to murmur among themselves. Some raised their phones to capture the last moments of the confrontation, whispering excitedly as if they'd just witnessed a scene out of a movie. A few even stepped onto their lawns, emboldened now that the danger had passed. One older man across the street called out, "Jack, you okay?" Jack gave a brief nod but didn't answer. His focus was still on the silence left behind. Finally, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. When the dispatcher picked up, his voice was calm and clipped, the tone of someone who knew how to report details with precision. "This is Jack Carter. 3 men dressed as police officers attempted a home invasion at my address. They were impersonating law enforcement, armed with a taser and batons. 2 of them are still in the area. I need officers dispatched immediately." Linda listened, her pulse still racing, but something about the calm way Jack delivered the report steadied her. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't afraid. He was in control, and that gave her strength. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens pierced the night, growing louder until red and blue lights flashed down the street. Real police cars screeched to a stop in front of their house, and uniformed officers poured out, weapons drawn, voices commanding authority in a way the fakes never could. "Hands where we can see them," an officer shouted, spotting 2 of the imposters limping toward their vehicle down the block. The men froze, panic replacing their earlier bravado. Within seconds they were face down on the asphalt, wrists cuffed, their fake badges clattering uselessly to the pavement. Jack watched silently, his arms still protectively around Linda's shoulders. When one of the officers approached him, Jack explained everything. Every word the imposters had said, every move they had made, every detail of their uniforms. His voice carried the weight of credibility, the kind that made people listen. The officer nodded, glancing back at the cuffed men. "They're not just in trouble for impersonating law enforcement. That's a felony by itself. Add in attempted assault and intimidation, and they'll be lucky to see daylight outside a cell again." Linda finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "They said it was HOA business. They said they could arrest me for not following HOA rules." The officer frowned. "That's nonsense. An HOA has no authority to arrest anyone. That sounds like organized intimidation. Do you have any idea who might be behind it?" Jack's jaw tightened. He didn't have proof yet, but his instincts pointed in one direction. "The HOA president," he said quietly. "These guys weren't freelancing. Someone sent them. And it's not hard to guess who benefits from scaring residents." The officer exchanged a look with his partner, then nodded. "We'll look into it." As the police hauled the men into the back of their cruisers, the neighbors finally spilled out of their houses, their whispers turning into open chatter. Phones flashed, recording every moment, capturing Jack standing tall on his porch like a guardian of the block. To them, he wasn't just another neighbor anymore, he was the man who had stood up when everyone else had stayed hidden. One woman whispered, "Did you see how fast he moved? Like he knew exactly what to do." Another added, "He didn't even look scared. Those guys never stood a chance." Jack didn't bask in the attention. He simply guided Linda back inside, closing the door gently behind them. But even as he locked it, he knew this wasn't the end. Inside the house, Linda finally let her guard down. She collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "Jack, what if they come back? What if next time they bring more?" He crouched in front of her, taking her hands in his. His voice was soft but unshakable. "Then I'll still be here. And I'll be ready. You don't have to be afraid, Linda. Not while I'm standing." She looked into his eyes and saw not just her husband, but the soldier who had once carried entire squads through danger. The man who had returned home with scars on his body but steel in his spirit. The man who didn't need a weapon to be dangerous. And for the first time since the night began, she believed him. Outside, the flashing lights faded as the police drove away with their prisoners. The street slowly returned to its eerie suburban quiet. But the atmosphere had changed. Everyone knew something big had just happened, something that would ripple through their community. Later that night, Jack sat by the window, watching the empty street. His mind turned over the details, the cheap uniforms, the way the men spoke, the mention of HOA rules. This wasn't random. This was calculated. And if the HOA president had really sent them, it meant the fight wasn't over. It meant war had just been declared. Jack wasn't afraid of war. He had lived through it, survived it, and carried it with him like a shadow that never left. But this was different. This was his home. His wife. His neighbors. And he wasn't going to let anyone turn their suburban street into a playground for corruption and intimidation. His phone buzzed with messages, neighbors thanking him, sharing videos, calling him a hero. He didn't reply to any of them. Hero was never a word he claimed for himself. He was a soldier, a protector, nothing more. But deep down, he knew the videos would spread. And when they did, the HOA president would see them. And that man would realize the same thing Jack already knew, the balance of power in the neighborhood had just shifted. The so-called HOA enforcers had thought they could bully their way into control. Tonight, they had been dismantled, not by guns or threats, but by a man who carried battlefield discipline into a suburban fight. Jack Carter wasn't just protecting his home. He had become the line no one could cross. And somewhere in the dark, he knew, the people behind those imposters were already plotting their next move. But Jack was ready. He had faced enemies far more dangerous. And this time, he had something even more powerful to fight for, his family, his community, and the promise that no one would ever terrorize them again. By morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with energy, the kind of energy that comes when ordinary life collides with something extraordinary. The videos neighbors had recorded of Jack dismantling the three imposters were everywhere, posted in group chats, uploaded on community pages, whispered about at the local coffee shop. What had happened on that quiet street wasn't just a late-night disturbance anymore. It had become a story, and stories travel fast. People who had never spoken to Jack before suddenly stopped him on the sidewalk, shaking his hand, thanking him, calling him a hero. Some even brought over baked goods or coffee, gestures of gratitude for standing up to the so-called HOA cops when everyone else had been too afraid. Linda, who had been terrified just hours earlier, found herself overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. Students' parents emailed her, neighbors left notes at their doorstep, and the school principal even told her that word had spread to the children. "Your husband's a real superhero," one student had told her with wide eyes. But while the neighborhood seemed united, Jack knew better than to assume victory. He had been on enough battlefields to recognize the patterns of power. When one side gets humiliated, the other side doesn't just disappear. They regroup, they rethink, they retaliate. And the HOA president wasn't the kind of man to quietly let his enforcers be taken down without response. Jack could already feel the storm building. It wasn't paranoia. It was instinct. Later that week, the Real police confirmed what Jack had already suspected. The three men weren't just random criminals, they were hired muscle, connected to a private security company with shady ties. Their uniforms, their fake badges, even their gear had been paid for by a slush fund tied directly to the HOA. The president, a smug man named Harold Briggs, had been funneling money from homeowners' dues into neighborhood protection services, but in reality, he was building a private army of bullies. The discovery lit a fire under the entire community. News outlets picked up the story, painting Jack as the veteran who had stood up to corruption. Reporters called, asking for interviews, but Jack declined them all. He wasn't interested in fame. He was interested in justice. Still, the videos and headlines spread. And with them came pressure. Pressure on the HOA, pressure on Briggs, and pressure on the police to act. Within weeks, investigators swarmed the HOA offices. They found doctored financial records, evidence of intimidation, and contracts with the very company that had sent the fake cops to Jack's door. Briggs was cornered, but he didn't go quietly. At the next community meeting, held in the local recreation center, he stood before the crowd with a slick smile, pretending nothing was wrong. He claimed the imposters had gone rogue, that the HOA had nothing to do with it, that he was as much a victim as anyone else. But the neighbors weren't buying it. Too many of them had seen the video, heard the threats, lived under the constant shadow of his petty rules and bullying tactics. And standing near the back of the room, arms folded, Jack Carter's mere presence was enough to tip the balance. When Briggs tried to brush off a question from an elderly woman about the missing HOA funds, Jack finally spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the room with the weight of someone who had earned the right to be heard. "You hired them," he said simply. Briggs stammered, I don't know what you're talking about." Jack took a step forward, his eyes locked on Briggs. "They weren't random thugs. They were on your payroll. They came to my house. They threatened my wife. And they wore uniforms bought with our neighbors' money. Don't lie to them. Not anymore." The room erupted, neighbors shouting questions, accusations, demanding answers. Briggs, red-faced and sweating, tried to maintain control, but the tide had turned. People who had once stayed silent now spoke up, emboldened by Jack's stand. The community that had been divided by fear was finally uniting, and Briggs was losing his grip. Within days, a petition circulated to dissolve the HOA entirely. Homeowners who had once been too scared to push back signed their names boldly, fueled by outrage and by the courage Jack had sparked in them. By the end of the month, the petition had more than enough signatures. The HOA that had ruled with intimidation for years was officially disbanded, its funds seized by the authorities, its president under investigation for fraud, impersonation, and conspiracy. For the first time in years, the neighborhood breathed freely. Lawns grew without fines, children played without threats, and families lived without constant harassment. Peace had finally returned, and it was because one man had refused to bow to fear. For Jack, though, the attention was uncomfortable. He had never wanted to be the center of a movement. He only wanted to protect his wife, his home, and his community. When neighbors praised him, he nodded politely but kept his words brief. When the news anchors called him a hero, he turned off the television. To him, it wasn't heroism. It was duty. One evening, weeks after the chaos had ended, Jack sat on the porch with Linda. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The neighborhood was quiet again, the way it should be. Linda leaned against him, her voice soft. "Do you ever wish none of this had happened?" Jack thought for a moment, his eyes on the horizon. "I wish you hadn't been scared," he admitted. "I wish our neighbors hadn't been bullied. But I don't regret standing up. Sometimes people need to see that fear can be beaten. That's how you win battles, by showing the enemy they don't own you." Linda smiled faintly, her fingers lacing through his. "I don't think they'll ever forget that night." He glanced at her, his expression softening. "Neither will I. But I'll tell you this neighborhood won't ever be the same. And that's a good thing." As the evening air grew cooler, the sound of children laughing drifted across the street, a sound that had been rare under the HOA's rule. It was proof that life had changed, that the shadow had lifted. Jack leaned back, finally allowing himself to relax. The battlefield, for now, was quiet. But in the back of his mind, he knew the truth he had always carried from his time in the service: peace is never permanent. Battles end, but vigilance must remain. Still, he wasn't worried. Because whatever came next, whatever challenge tried to creep into their lives, Jack Carter was ready. He had faced wars on foreign soil and wars in his own backyard. And every time, he had walked away standing. The suburbs had tried to become a battlefield, but they hadn't reckoned with a soldier who knew how to win wars. And as long as Jack was there, no one would ever succeed in turning his home into a battlefield again.